Hello everyone, this is Gary Byrne. I'm the managing editor with the SAPexperts Financials and GRC Hubs, and I'm here at the GRC 2013 show. And I'm glad that we have Jamie Levitt, Jamie Draper, Sandeep Malik, and Elizabeth McNichol, all with PwC, to field some questions and a panel discussion for you today. So the first question is for Elizabeth and Jamie Levitt. How are clients leveraging the continuous monitoring technology today?
All right. Well, I'll just walk you through some of the case studies that we've been doing at our clients. We have a client who we recently did a controls optimization for, and the way we did this was we went out and we took their controls. We did a risk analysis. We first removed any controls that they didn't need, and then we said, okay, before we start using continuous monitoring, let's say, how can we further automate your existing controls in SAP? So we identified the controls to automate in SAP, and then we layered on top of that PC capabilities by saying, what can we use PC to automate as well? So workflow enablement of detective reporting, monitoring of the automated controls we just implemented to really deliver an end-to-end solution and save them a significant amount of time operating and evaluating their controls. So.
Yep, and in general, we're seeing clients start to really leverage continuous monitoring, continuous transaction monitoring, both in process controls, a solution like fraud management. This is kind of the wave of the future of audit, of fraud detection. This is kind of something that we see that is going to make a more efficient audit process, a more effective audit process. You're going to see internal audit organizations leveraging technology to, instead of sample items, they'll test full populations. So we really see this as changing kind of the face of how we would go about doing a fraud audit or an internal audit.
And I have another good example of where we used a more continuous transaction analysis approach. This was a client that had issues with their payables process, whereby they knew they had duplicate payments going out the door, but the way they were finding out about them was their customers were calling them and saying, hey, why'd you just send me another $100,000? So we went out and we were able to implement some really unique integrity checks over it, where we were able to say if an invoice looks similar or is a same amount different currency or was to a similar vendor, let's identify those invoices as they go into the system so that you can actually stop bad transactions from going out. And in this instance, we did some other things around vendors, other areas of invoices and payments, and we actually were able to save the client 9 times the license and services in the first 60 days after we went live. So it was a really neat project.
Yep. And to build on Jamie's example, we're also seeing clients leverage continuous transaction monitoring for other regulations outside of kind of areas of financial compliance. So FCPA, for example, the vendor payment process is really a critical component of FCPA requirements. And so we're seeing clients leverage this idea of continuous transaction monitoring to look for tests like employee records and employee addresses matching vendor addresses, where you have vendor analysis on vendors that are service-only vendors. So these types of tests that historically have had to go through large amounts of data and have been quite cumbersome are now becoming much easier to execute leveraging technology.
Okay. All right. The next question for Jamie Draper. Where do we see the return on investment achieved by clients with continuous monitoring?
Thank you, Gary. And that's probably the question that I get asked the most. I mean, a lot of companies now, we're in an economic downturn. There's competing priorities within the IT organization. Everybody has a number of projects on. So how do you look at these technologies and look and say, what is the return that the company's going to get for this? And how do I prioritize continuous monitoring or fraud management above some of the other initiatives that companies have got? And I think if I start at the beginning, as Jamie and Elizabeth have talked about, when we look at companies in this space, we tend to look first at doing control optimization work. Has a company got the right number of controls in place? Can we reduce the number of controls? Do we have the right amount of automation in there just by leveraging the inherent functionality within SAP? Companies change, and we mentioned the environment changing. The changing processes that a company has means that if you sit on your controls for a continuing period of time, then you may run the risk of having controls for control's sake. You may be over-controlled in certain areas, under-controlled in other areas. Understanding where those risks are really helps you drive where you're going to get the best return for your investment. So if you start looking at the controls and the risks, that gives you the platform to then move forward and leverage the technology. And so with the technology, as we've heard about, you then have, what we've seen with companies is a sort of maturity cycle that started with companies looking at continuous monitoring for access. What that's done is enable companies to very quickly and easily get a handle on where their segregation of duty and sensitive access risks are and help manage that. That in itself has created a great return on investment, because without the technology, it takes a significant amount of manual effort to achieve the same result. The next enhancement we've seen is with the process controls and looking at how you document controls in a control repository. And what that has enabled is it allows companies to look at their compliance initiatives, look at the regulatory frameworks they need to comply with, and be smarter about how they look at controls and test controls. So it enables them to reduce the number of controls they're doing and effectively manage the application and testing of those controls. And then we run on to the specific examples of continuous monitoring. And then what we're seeing now is like these technologies enabling us to take manual controls and automate them even more. So what that does is that gives you a continuous return on investment, starting with automating controls, looking at continuous monitoring, and helping reduce that. And I think the true answer is it depends on the industry you're in as to which controls or how much of the return you'll get. But we're seeing a significant return. And as I said at the beginning, this is the question I'm asked all the time by my clients. How do I justify this? And we're working with all of our clients to work out what that return on investment is. And we're seeing a significant number undertake these projects now because the technology is enabling them to get more out of it.
Okay, thank you. All right, and the third question and the final question would be for Sandeep and Jamie Draper again, and that's where do you see continuous monitoring technologies going from here?
So thank you. I'll take a first stab at this, and I'll pass it to Sandeep. So I think the one thing here at the conference that we've seen, there's been a lot of talk. We had the announcement of fraud management earlier. We have the announcement of SAP's GRC 10.1. The biggest thing with both of those technologies is that they run on HANA. HANA is really enabling companies to look at big amounts of data and do that rapidly and quickly. The other big advantage is that it enables you to go across multiple platforms and bring that data together and do real-time analytics. Okay, and that really is, if we take the return on investment question one step further, is what can I do now, what can I do tomorrow? So when I use these technologies, I go in and I address the base that I've got, and then I address future needs, and I look at the way that I'm looking at fraud management to sort of say, okay, how can I prevent things from happening? And I'll let Sandeep talk a little bit about more of the technical details behind some of this.
Thanks, Jamie. So, like Jamie had just said about HANA, it's a new technology, as we know. It's getting more momentum, and more people are going for it. So it's actually the true example of how the new emerging technologies can enable so many new things, which otherwise, it's not that it cannot be done, but it's very, very difficult to do. For example, fraud management. Now, finding a fraud in the organization is a very challenging job, because fraud does not happen generally by one person. There can be a group of people who get involved, make certain transactions, they form a kind of hand-holding or collusion, and then that's where the fraud happens. So when you basically want to find it, what we are dealing with is multiple environments, numerous environments. a very large data of so many transactions, and then from there you are trying to find out, has a fraud truly happened? Now, going with the traditional technologies, when you're dealing with such heavy data volumes, doing this becomes very, very difficult. And that's where these new technologies like fraud management comes into picture. You can perform analysis, whether it's a segregation of duty analysis, where you really want to find out, has actually segregation of duties resulted into a violation, or it's certain transaction analysis where you truly want to find, like going to Elizabeth example, how many times a duplicate payment has happened in accounts payable, for example. So when you basically want to perform those analyses using the HANA technologies, and on top of that, putting the layer of fraud management, now will let the people basically perform huge analysis and do a trend analysis on that, trying to see the patterns, trying to see that where is that odd transaction which can point out to that, yes, there is a possibility of fraud happening. So all these things can happen in the fraud management now, but it's the basic thing is the technologies which is enabling it. And that's other thing which I wanted to add. We get this question many times, how it is different than the continuous monitoring, like what process control is doing at this time. The difference is that process control is very good for continuous monitoring, but when you are talking about how do we find a pattern, how we find a trend, is there a possibility I can know in advance that this particular chain of transactions can lead into finally a fraud? Yes, now you can do it with the fraud management. So I think this is how technically we are reaching into that era where some of those things which were very difficult to do will be able to do in the coming days.
Sandeep, what about mobile technologies? What are you seeing for developments there?
Great question, Gary. When we go to different customers, this is one of the topic which is basically touched at almost every customer, with so many emphasis happening on mobile technologies and the endless possibilities. One question always asked is, how do you feel that mobile technologies can make some significant process improvement or some significant reduction in the risk? And that's where mobile technologies, they start playing their role. Let's just see how it happens in traditional way. You find a fraud, or you find there is some issue with a continuous transaction monitoring. Alert is raised through a workflow, and people need to go to the system, they need to analyze, and then they finally need to decide the corrective action. Now, some of these conflicts or violations are really time sensitive. The mobile technologies basically can do is, the moment you find this conflict, you can send the alert directly to the mobile, and from the mobile going forward, I'm just talking about the roadmap, there is a possibility that you can provide all the relevant analysis and even an actionable item where the person who gets the alert, and if he is authorized, the person can actually block the transaction there itself. A simple example is, for example, a user access, where you see that because of this user there is some fraud which is going to happen. So through mobile technologies, instead of logging into the system which you may not have access at the time, you can directly do it from the mobile technologies. Now just imagine a risk which could have basically potentially grown so big, you can just cut it there itself in the real time, because you get your alerts in the real time on mobile, and you can do it from anywhere you want. There is no need of having your system, laptop access or anything of that kind.
Great, thank you.